Did you know that in medieval Europe, one of the most feared forms of punishment left absolutely no marks on the body, no bruises, no cuts, no broken bones, and yet could kill a person just as effectively as a blade? Medieval Europe. Around 1200 AD, the method involved tying a prisoner to a wooden board, coating the soles of their bare feet in salt water, and then bringing in a goat. The goat licked the feet. The prisoner laughed and kept laughing and could not stop. According to historical records, laughter itself, uncontrolled, involuntary, sustained beyond any limit the human body was designed to endure, became the instrument of death. This is the forgotten history of tickle torture. Europe in the year 1200 AD operated on a theory of justice that modern legal philosophy finds uncomfortable to examine, but that was entirely coherent within its own framework. The punishment of criminals and enemies of the state was not designed to rehabilitate. It was not designed to deter in the subtle psychological sense that modern criminology attempts. It was designed to inflict a proportionate, or in extreme cases, a maximally severe, physical experience of suffering in response to the transgression that had been committed. Public punishment served multiple functions simultaneously. It was theatre. It was information, communicating to everyone who witnessed it what the state was capable of and what behaviors it would not tolerate. It was theology. In a world where physical pain was understood as connected to spiritual purification and divine judgment, the punishment of the body carried meaning that extended beyond the flesh. And it was, in the most direct and unambiguous sense, a demonstration of power. Within this framework, the medieval legal and penal system developed an enormous variety of specific punishment techniques over the centuries, ranging from the straightforwardly violent, flogging, branding, mutilation, to the elaborately mechanical, the rack, the brazen bull, various forms of confinement, to a category of punishment that is less widely discussed, but which historical records confirm was in documented use. Methods designed not to leave visible marks on the body while still producing severe and sustainable suffering. This category existed because of a specific legal and social complication that affected particularly the punishment of nobles and higher status. Individuals, visible physical disfigurement, a brand, a missing hand, a scarred back, marked a person's social status in permanent and public ways that complicated their subsequent life in medieval society. For prisoners whose post-punishment existence was relevant to consider, methods that produced suffering without visible marking had a specific utility. Tickle torture was one of these methods, and the people who designed it understood exactly what they were doing. The specific form of tickle torture that is described in multiple historical sources from medieval Europe involved a small number of components, each chosen with a logic that becomes apparent when examined carefully. The prisoner was restrained, bound to a flat surface, typically a wooden board or table, in a position that left the feet exposed and accessible. The restraints were tight enough to prevent any meaningful movement of the lower body. The prisoner's ability to pull their feet away from what was about to happen to them was eliminated entirely. The feet were then prepared. Historical accounts describe the washing of the soles of the feet, removing dirt and callus that would reduce sensitivity, and then the application of a liquid. The most commonly described liquid in the historical sources is brine, concentrated salt water. Salt water applied to the sole of a foot in preparation for repeated mechanical stimulation serves several functions simultaneously. It softens the skin, increasing the sensitivity of the nerve endings in the sole. It maintains moisture, preventing the skin from drying and reducing sensation. And it provides a persistent flavor that the animal recruited for the next stage would find appealing enough to continue its work without being prompted. The animal was a goat. The choice of goat over other available domestic animals reflects a specific practical observation. The goat's tongue is notably rough. The surface is covered with papillae, the small projections that give all mammal tongues their texture, but in goats these are particularly pronounced. Running a goat's tongue repeatedly across the sole of a human foot produces a sensation that is qualitatively different from the touch of a smoother surface. It is more intense, more varied, and more capable of sustaining the involuntary neurological response that produces laughter. Goats will lick salt from any available surface as a natural feeding behavior. Salt is a necessary mineral for goats, and they seek it out instinctively. A salt-coated surface presented at the appropriate height would hold a goat's attention for as long as the salt remained available. When the salt was exhausted, more was applied. The process continued. The neuroscience of ticklishness, the involuntary physical response that tickle torture exploited, is a subject that modern research has investigated with considerable sophistication. Understanding why tickling produces laughter and why that laughter cannot be suppressed helps explain both how the punishment worked and why it was so effective as a tool of psychological and physical coercion. The specific type of tickle sensation relevant to tickle torture is called gargalesis, the deep tickle produced by sustained, rhythmic pressure on sensitive areas of the body, as opposed to the lighter sensation of a feather touch. Gargalesis produces a reflexive response in the central nervous system that bypasses voluntary control. When the appropriate nerve endings in the foot are stimulated in the right way, the response, the muscle contractions, the vocalizations we call laughter, is generated at a neurological level that the conscious mind cannot override. This is why you cannot tickle yourself. The anticipatory neural signals generated when you know you are about to touch your own foot suppress the reflex response before it can be triggered. But when someone, or something, else creates the stimulus without warning and without voluntary anticipation, the reflex fires regardless of whether the person experiencing it wants it to. The medieval practitioners of tickle torture had discovered an empirical truth that neuroscience would not formally explain until the 20th century. Laughter can be involuntary, sustained, and entirely against the will of the person producing it. The specific nerve distribution in the human foot makes it one of the most reliably sensitive areas for gargalesis. The soles of the feet contain a high density of Meissner corpuscles, nerve endings specialized for detecting light touch and texture changes, as well as Merkel cells and Ruffini endings that respond to sustained pressure. The goat's rough tongue, moving repeatedly across this densely innervated surface, produced a continuous and varied stimulation that the nervous system could not habituate to quickly enough to suppress the reflex response. Within the first minutes of this stimulation, the prisoner would laugh, not in the way that something amusing produces laughter, in the way that a reflex produces a reflex, without choice, without pause, without any of the social or emotional context that normally accompanies the sound. The first few minutes of tickle torture were, paradoxically, the least severe phase. The nervous system's reflex response was firing cleanly, the laughter was reflexive but not yet distressing, and the body had not yet begun to experience the physiological consequences of sustained involuntary muscular activity. For a brief period, an outside observer might have mistaken what they were seeing for something benign, a person laughing. The transformation came progressively but inevitably. Laughter, at its physiological core, is a vigorous muscular activity. The abdominal muscles contract repeatedly and forcefully. The diaphragm, the large muscle beneath the lungs that controls breathing, goes into a pattern of rapid rhythmic contractions that are partially synchronized with, but partially in conflict with normal respiratory function. In ordinary circumstances of laughter, the episode is brief, the muscles recover, and breathing normalizes quickly. In sustained involuntary, uninterruptible laughter, none of these normalizations can occur. After 10 minutes of continuous involuntary laughter, the abdominal muscles begin to experience fatigue and the early symptoms of muscle stress. Breathing becomes increasingly difficult. The rapid, shallow respirations associated with sustained laughter are less efficient at oxygenating the blood than normal breathing. Oxygen saturation in the blood begins to decline. The body's stress response, The sympathetic nervous system activation that produces elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and increased metabolic demand is triggered and remains continuously activated. After 30 minutes, the picture darkens considerably. The skin on the soles of the feet, subjected to continuous rough friction from the goat's tongue and softened by the salt water, begins to show surface damage. The combination of mechanical abrasion and salt creates a sensation that shifts from the pure reflex of ticklishness to include an additional layer of genuine pain, a burning, raw discomfort that the laughter mechanism does not suppress, and that the prisoner cannot escape through voluntary movement. The prisoner, who had begun by laughing, was now simultaneously laughing, crying, gasping for breath, and experiencing the burning pain of abraded skin, all without any ability to stop any of these responses. The historical documentation of tickle torture in medieval Europe is real, but requires careful interpretation. The primary sources are a mixture of legal records, travel accounts, and chronicles, none of them with the systematic documentation that modern historians would prefer, but collectively sufficient to establish that the practice existed and was used in specific documented contexts. The most credible historical documentation comes from administrative and legal records of the 13th and 14th centuries that reference punishment methods in ways consistent with the practice. German-language legal texts from this period include references to punishment techniques that match the description of goat licking, without always using specific terminology. Court records from several northern Italian city-states, where the sophisticated urban legal systems of medieval Italy were more likely to generate written documentation than the more rural courts of northern Europe, include descriptions of non-marking punishment methods that legal historians have interpreted as referencing forms of this practice. The association of this torture method with political prisoners and nobles is particularly well documented and makes the most historical sense. The specific utility of a punishment that left no visible marks was greatest precisely in cases where the prisoner's public appearance after release mattered, where the visible evidence of mistreatment would create political complications or generate sympathy. A nobleman who had been on the rack showed his suffering on his body. A nobleman who had been subjected to tickle torture showed nothing at all. The Chinese historical record includes parallel documentation of similar practices. During the Han Dynasty, roughly contemporaneous with the Roman period in the West, historical texts describe the use of tickle-based torture, specifically for prisoners of noble rank, with the same rationale. Effective coercion without physical marking. The independent development of this approach in two separate civilizations with no known direct contact during this period suggests that the underlying logic, exploiting an involuntary physiological response as a tool of control, was arrived at independently by people working from the same basic human biology. The claim that tickle torture could kill requires medical examination because it is not immediately obvious that laughter, however prolonged and involuntary, should be a lethal mechanism. Modern physiology and sports medicine provide the framework for understanding how sustained involuntary muscular exertion of the type produced by continuous laughter could, under specific conditions, result in death. The most direct lethal mechanism is cardiac stress, the sustained activation of the sympathetic nervous system that accompanies involuntary laughter. Elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, increased cardiac output places continuous and elevated demand on the heart. In individuals with any pre-existing cardiac vulnerability, this sustained stress can trigger ventricular arrhythmia or cardiac arrest. In medieval prisoners who may already have been weakened by imprisonment, malnourishment, and previous treatment, the cardiac reserve available to meet this demand was likely compromised. The respiratory mechanism is also documented. Sustained involuntary laughter disrupts the normal respiratory cycle sufficiently that blood oxygen saturation can decline to levels that cause first unconsciousness, and then, if the situation continues, brain damage and death. This is the same mechanism as other forms of asphyxia, produced through an unusual pathway. The diaphragm is not blocked from moving, but its movement is coordinated with laughter rather than with breathing, producing inadequate gas exchange over time. Physical shock, the body's response to sustained extreme stress, is a third mechanism. The combination of pain from the abraded feet, the metabolic stress of continuous muscular activity, the psychological terror of an experience one cannot control, and the cardiovascular strain all combine to produce a systemic stress response that can progress to circulatory collapse in individuals without the physical resources to sustain it. Modern laughter-induced death, while rare, is a documented medical phenomenon. People have died from cardiac events triggered by sustained laughter. The medieval practitioners had no knowledge of these mechanisms, but they had empirical observation of outcomes. The question of whether tickle torture was effective as an interrogation tool, whether it actually produced reliable confessions or information, is one that the historical sources address indirectly, and that modern psychology can assess with somewhat more analytical precision. The general finding of modern research on coercive interrogation is that methods producing extreme physical or psychological distress are counterproductive as information-gathering tools, because subjects in extreme distress will say whatever they believe will stop the distress, regardless of whether it is true. This insight, that torture produces compliance rather than truth, is not a modern discovery. It was observed and commented on by ancient and medieval writers with enough frequency that some practitioners of coercive interrogation in those periods were aware of the problem. In the case of tickle torture specifically, the mechanism of compliance was perhaps more direct than in some other torture methods. The experience of the laughter reflects overriding voluntary control of the body doing something the mind could not stop, was profoundly disorienting in a way that went beyond ordinary pain. Pain, however severe, is experienced as something happening to the body from outside. The laughter of tickle torture originated inside the body and felt to the person experiencing it like a loss of self-control that was qualitatively different from being hurt. The body had turned against itself. The person was betraying themselves with every involuntary laugh. This psychological dimension, the experience of losing control of one's own responses, of producing laughter in a situation of absolute terror, was likely a significant factor in the effectiveness of the method for breaking psychological resistance. The prisoner who had maintained their composure under questioning could not maintain their composure while unable to stop laughing. The dignity that sustained resistance required was impossible to preserve in a situation that was, by its nature, undignified. The effectiveness in extracting any particular truth was a separate question that the method's designers were apparently not focused on with precision. The use of sustained involuntary laughter as a tool of punishment and coercion appears in historical records from cultures that had no known contact with medieval Europe's specific practices, suggesting that the basic approach, exploiting a physiological reflex for purposes of control, was arrived at independently in multiple contexts. The Chinese historical record is the most thoroughly documented parallel. During the Han Dynasty, which ruled China from approximately 206 BC to 220 AD, court records describe a practice called lawing punishment that was specifically designated for use against prisoners of noble or aristocratic rank. The rationale is explicit in the historical texts. Methods that left visible marks on the body were considered inappropriate for individuals of high status, both because of the social complications mentioned earlier and because of specific Chinese philosophical traditions about the integrity of the body that made disfigurement a particularly serious form of degradation. The Han Dynasty laughing punishment used different implements than the medieval European goat method. Feathers and specific manual techniques are described rather than animals, but the underlying mechanism was identical. Sustained stimulation of areas with high nerve sensitivity to produce involuntary laughter that could not be controlled or stopped by the prisoner. Japanese historical sources from the Edo period include references to similar practices in contexts of judicial punishment and interrogation. Persian historical accounts reference laughter-inducing methods in descriptions of palace punishment of court officials who had fallen from favor. In each case, the method appears in contexts where the specific quality of not leaving physical marks, of producing suffering that was real but invisible, was valued. What this distribution of independent development suggests is that the practitioners of these methods in different cultures were all responding to the same underlying reality, that the human nervous system contains reflexes that can be exploited to produce responses that the person cannot voluntarily control. That insight, once discovered, tended to be used. The historical record shows a decline in the documented use of tickle torture as a formal punishment method across the late medieval and early modern periods in Europe, though the timeline of this decline varies by region, and the practice's disappearance from formal legal documentation does not necessarily mean its complete cessation in practice. Several factors contributed to the decline. The development of more sophisticated legal philosophy in the late medieval period, associated particularly with the rediscovery and incorporation of Roman legal thinking into European legal systems during the 12th and 13th centuries, produced gradual conceptual changes in how punishment was understood and justified. The Roman legal tradition, while certainly not opposed to harsh punishment, had developed a more procedurally formalized approach to the administration of justice that created at least theoretical constraints on arbitrary and informal punishment methods. The Reformation and the religious conflicts of the 16th century produced, paradoxically, both an intensification of some forms of persecution and the beginning of a philosophical critique of torture as a reliable method of establishing truth. Writers across the Reformation period noted the problem that torture produced compliance rather than truth, that a person in extreme distress would confess to anything. This critique applied to all torture methods, including tickle torture, and while it did not immediately change practice, it began the intellectual process that would eventually produce Enlightenment-era legal reforms explicitly prohibiting torture. The physical evidence that modern archaeologists and museum curators have documented from this period is limited but real. Several European museums, including institutions in Germany and Switzerland, hold medieval restraint devices that historians have associated with non-marking punishment methods, though the specific attribution of particular devices to tickle torture rather than other restraint purposes is sometimes disputed by scholars. The history of tickle torture sits at an uncomfortable intersection of the absurd and the genuinely disturbing. It is a story about laughter, something that human culture universally associates with joy, connection, and pleasure being weaponized into an instrument of suffering and death. The inversion is so complete, so paradoxical, that it is difficult to hold both dimensions of the reality in mind simultaneously. But that paradox is precisely what makes the history worth examining. The people who designed and implemented tickle torture were not confused about what they were doing. They were not accidentally discovering that laughter could be a vehicle for suffering while intending something benign. They were deliberately exploiting a neurological reflex, a mechanism that evolution had produced as a byproduct of play behavior and social bonding for the purpose of control and coercion. They found a vulnerability in human biology and used it. This pattern, the identification of a human capacity or vulnerability and its deliberate weaponization, appears throughout the history of torture and coercive punishment. The innovators of tickle torture made no new discovery about human biology. Goats had always been willing to lick salt. Human feet had always been sensitive. The nerve pathways that produced involuntary laughter had always been present. What changed was the decision to use this combination of existing facts as a tool of power. The legacy of this history is not primarily the specific method, Tickle torture as a formal punishment practice is documented as historical, is universally condemned by modern human rights standards, and has no legitimate contemporary application. The legacy is the question it poses about the relationship between power and the body, about who has the authority to exploit another person's involuntary responses and what constraints exist on that authority. Every generation that has confronted this question has eventually arrived at the same answer, that the body's involuntary responses belong to the person whose body they are, that no authority, legal, religious, or political, has the right to exploit them, that the laughter which signals joy should not be made to signal death. These conclusions seem obvious now. They were not always obvious. Understanding why not. Understanding the historical, theological, and political frameworks that made tickle torture possible is part of understanding how human beings have arrived at the rights we now consider self-evident.